I do encourage people to show up as your authentic self, but a lot of people don't know who that authentic self is because they've been told to be a certain way their whole
Yeah.
life. So that's the number one assignment is do some solid work on.
Hey, everybody, welcome to the Grow Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Kevin McNulty, and this is your personal development school of growth, where each week my guests and I will bring and break down big ideas and practices that will help you learn, grow, and succeed in life. Thanks for checking us out. Now let the growth begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Grow Yourself, Personal Development School of Growth. My name's Kevin McNulty, and today we're going to talk about conversations. It's honestly one of my favorite topics for a couple of reasons. One, because I love having conversations. It's been the staple of my life forever. In fact, frankly, when I go out with my family, particularly my two young daughters are there, they're always very nervous on who I'm going to strike up a conversation with and can we get out of this restaurant when we were actually supposed to leave because dad decided he's going to have a conversation with somebody sitting at the bar or something like that. So, in any event, you know, I would say, though, in this world where we are constantly bombarded with distractions, frankly, it's easy to forget the value of a good conversation. And I do mean good conversation, but the truth is, human connection, I believe, were designed for relationships and that the connection with other human beings are part of our well-being, are part of who we are, and therefore the concept of conversations is one of the most powerful ways to foster that connection, if you will. So whether it's a deep or just meaningful exchange with a loved one, or just a casual chat with somebody in a coffee bar, or whatever the case might be, we're going to talk about all of that. And my guest is really an authority on that. She's written an incredible book, and I mean she goes into a deep dive about conversations, the importance of conversations, and how they build relationships, and how we build connections, and all those other sorts of things. And so, I would like to welcome not only an authority on these sorts of things, but I'm just so happy to say a friend of mine, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Patty DiNucci.
Thank you, Kevin. What a joy to be here.
Oh, the pleasure is mine, And Patty, we have so much to talk about. I have a lot of questions for you. The first thing, though, would you please just tell the audience who is Patty DiNucci? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Who is Patty DiNucci? Well, I grew up in a mining town in northern Minnesota, so I come from small town roots
Oh
up
my.
north where it's cold. I live in Austin, Texas now.
Mm.
I've always been someone who enjoyed um, making friends, playing with other kids. My dad was the local Chevy dealer, and he was very gregarious. And when you talk about, when are we going to get out of this restaurant because Dad's in a conversation, that was us.
Oh my
It
gosh.
was up until I swear the day he died, he was like that. Um, and my mom a little more comported and a little more introverted, but still probably one of the most gracious people in town.
Oh
So
my.
I had really good conversation role models. I have been a marketing communications consultant and writer for many years. I've always been a writer.
Mm.
I'm a speaker. I paint a little bit. I love dogs. I love nature. I enjoy Texas very much, except in July and August. And I go back north, wherever. I'm an ambivert too, which means I am exactly half introvert and extrovert. And so when I approach the topic of conversation or networking or relationships, it's from the point of view of someone who both loves people until I
Wow.
don't. And then I
Wow.
retreat and go
Yeah.
back into my little world and, sit on the deck and watch the birds or write or paint or read. I don't know. It's pretty nice being me, except I have to really predict which me am I going to be
That's
at any given
fascinating.
moment.
No, that's fascinating. Now, there's two things though that I know about you. One, you say I don't remember what you said. I'm an okay painter, but actually I understand you're actually a pretty good painter.
Well, I minored in art in college. And I remember seeing my high school art teacher at a class reunion a few years ago. And when I told him, he said, "Are you still painting? Oh, you're so good. You're still painting, right?" And at that time, I was not.
Mm.
And he was so disappointed. And
Oh,
then the
no.
pandemic came, and I remembered his little message. And that was one of my ways of
Oh,
getting
man.
through the pandemic. So I have a whole new portfolio of things. Like we used a little bit of my artwork on the cover of my book. This is just a little
Oh,
abstract thing
wow.
I did.
Interesting. Now, the
Yeah.
second thing is that I understand that there's something actually quite unique about the hometown that you were raised in.
Yes. If anyone's ever seen the movie Field of
But
Dreams,
of course,
this is the town where Ray Kinsella and forgot the other character's name is. They go to find Moonlight Graham, who was a baseball player, very gifted baseball player, but was someone who decided to become a doctor. And he was a real person in our town. He gave my older sisters their polio shots, which is a
wow.
very historical thing when you think about it. And many of the people portrayed in the movie were family friends. The lady that was the editor of the
My.
newspaper, she was at my grandmother's funeral. She sent me Christmas cards every year up until she died. So
Oh,
yeah, that's our
man.
town's claim to fame. Other than also being one of the many towns across northern Minnesota that housed people that worked in the mines that helped build all the cities. New York and
Wow.
Chicago, and helped us win the wars. The world. That's the other
Yeah.
thing. I grew up with people from all over the world. Everybody's grandmother spoke a different language, which talking
Yes.
about conversation, people still tried to talk to each other. It was just always really unusual.
Wow. Well, listen, I know that that you, before we get started, that you tend to sort of create this vision or this intention for a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think it would be only right to ask you, what is your intention for this conversation?
Well, both my vision and my vision would be what would great look like, and that would be that you and I have fun and that this is enjoyable,
Mm,
but that we reveal some things that are helpful to your listeners because that's the number one reason why we do this, right?
that's
And
right.
then my intention is to just show up as myself, which it's astonishing how often people show up in conversation, especially something like this that's recorded and
That's
it's on
right.
video and all that. People get really locked up, and I've done it too over the years, when I was new at this. Showing up as our authentic self, because who else are we going to be?
Yes. Okay. So you bring up a very important point there in that, you know, many people come into conversations or in this venue in a podcast when they're being interviewed, of course, with the best of intentions. They want to put their best foot forward. They want to be impressionable in a positive way and all these sorts of things. They want to say the right thing. They don't want to be embarrassed. So the intentions are right. But it's a bit counterintuitive that when you like to have a really solid, deep conversation, you really should let go of all of that, correct?
Yeah, it almost makes no sense. And there's a couple of ways to look at this. Like, I do encourage people show up as your authentic self, but a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people don't know who that authentic self is
Mm-hmm.
because they've been told to be a certain way their whole
Yeah,
lives. So that's the number one assignment, is do some solid work on yourself. There's a fantastic book out there called Insight by Tasha
mm.
Urich. And according to her data, she believes that 95% of us don't even know ourselves. So
Wow.
yeah, I'm sure you have too. I've spent a lot of time getting to, I'm an ambivert. I know a lot about myself. I know when I'm going to be at my best and I know when I'm not. And I know the things I like and the things that energize me and the things that drain me and the things that are okay and the things that aren't. And but a lot of us are so busy trying to keep our job or make our spouse
Right.
happy or keep the neighbors happy that we lose ourselves.
Yeah.
So that's part of showing up authentically. But then in my book, I talk about this showing up authentically doesn't mean just letting it all hang out and saying things that aren't kind, that are brash or crass or impolite. um Sharing too much information. We're in an age right now where I think a lot of people are sharing way too much information about their
Agree.
lives.
Agree.
So authenticity is this little it's like the pixie out in the garden. Now, she's going to show up but only if you're not looking. She's going to be
Oh,
fun and
very interesting.
playful,
I love the way you say
but
that.
you
Yeah.
can't stare too long.
Yeah.
Maybe I could say the rabbit that comes to your garden, or, the
Yeah.
deer that we have deer that come into our backyard, and they love it when we're out on the deck, but they don't like us to stare at them. So, this authenticity piece is really
Hmm.
tricky, but it is the key
I
to
think
really being yourself.
I like what you said, that it is tricky. I've often
Hmm.
asked when we get into this conversation about the authentic you, I sometimes ask the guests, well, what if my authentic me sucks? Then what? Well, you said it earlier though, that you really do, I would say particularly now, have to work at it. You have to put the work in
Yeah.
to, because your authentic you, I mean, I think it's just a fundamental question, and it certainly goes to conversation, no doubt about this. But just to stay on this point for just a second, who is the authentic you? And to me, there becomes this peeling away of all of the crap that we have
Hmm.
brought into our personality, into our lives, our lackluster way, and the only reason I believe that I have, to whatever degree, have can recognize my authentic me, believe it or not, it's been through a lot of pain and
Sure.
self-awareness.
Hmm.
There's limits to where we should go with self-awareness, from the
Oh,
standpoint,
yeah.
from the standpoint that sometimes, and I still do it now, I can eat myself alive trying to overthink
Yeah.
something that I feel, think, do. But over the span of a lifetime, I have been able to get a little bit more to the core of
Hmm.
who I am. And so I guess my point is the bottom line is you do have to put in some work.
You do have to put in some work, but you bring up a really interesting point. Um, there's a woman out there named Ruth Whitman, and she's
Mm,
written a lot about, I think one of her books is called America the Anxious. And there's another one out there too. And she's written some really fantastic articles about how even pre-pandemic, and this is going to be that thing about let's always have balance and moderation in our
yeah.
lives. She believes that this whole movement of let's go within to find our happiness. Let's go within to find out who we are,
Mm,
that we've taken that to the extreme, to the point where we are overthinking
yes.
ourselves. And it's this brings us back to conversation. Have you ever noticed, and I definitely noticed, when I've had too much time to myself, I start getting into these weird thinking loops and talking to myself a little more and worrying a little more, and
Hmm.
and just definitely overthinking, over worrying. Whereas and that's how I know it's time to get back out and call a friend or schedule a coffee or a happy hour or
Mm.
dinner, or, you know, go have lunch with my guy. Um, that we should know ourselves, but to overdo it means we're getting down in there and getting a little neurotic about it.
So, Patty, you wrote a great book on a super deep dive into conversations, and I want to hear about it. It's called More Than Just Talk. And I mean, the first thing is just kind of there it is right there. Show it one more
Mhm.
time, please. More Than Just Talk. Beautiful. And I didn't know that
It's
artwork
pretty
was yours, but it makes sense.
my
So,
artwork.
I mean, what inspired it? Just why did you write it?
Well, my first book, have to show this one too. This is my first book, The Intentional Networker,
Love
award
it.
winner. Okay. This has
Oh,
been
very
selling since
nice.
2011.
Stop.
That's when I first came out with it. And that book was about how to be more intentional, more purposeful, more mindful about how you network, and not feeling like you have to be, attending happy hours and luncheons and breakfast, 7 days a week and whipping out
Right.
business. It's not about that. That sounds
Boy,
exhausting
I
unless
know
you're
people like that.
an extreme extrovert would love that. I'm
Yeah.
not that person.
No.
So I was getting a lot of questions about, well, Patty, you network so well. Like, how are you able to do it? And so I mapped out my process and my best practices with that book. But why did I come out with the second book? Because I was still getting questions about, yeah, I get your networking philosophies. I love it. This is a great book. But what about just the conversation piece? Like,
Mm.
how do we get things started? How do we shift the conversation when it goes in a direction that we're not enjoying? How do we get out of the I was getting all these questions, like bags and bags of 3x5 note cards where whenever I spoke or wherever I did a workshop, I would have people write down their big question about conversation.
Mm.
And that's what drove the book. So I discovered that, first of all, there's a ton of benefits, piles of obstacles on why we're not having the conversations we want to be having, and then all kinds of best practices, strategies, tips, philosophies that can help us have the conversations we want to be having. So this book, it would have been thicker had my dear
It's
friend and
400
editor.
pages or something, isn't it?
Well, it's a lot of pages, but it's not
Right.
dense. I mean, I when I write a book, I like to highlight and write things in the margins and
Yes.
put
And
my
there's kind of some
thoughts.
worksheets in there and that sort of
There's
thing as well, right?
worksheets.
I think that's very important. Yeah, it's not
It's
just a
kind of
big
like
blob of
it's
text.
kind of
Yeah.
like a workbook in some areas.
Yeah.
But yes, why did I write it? Because there was much more to say about human interaction. And the more I dug into the research, some people call research procrastinating, and maybe that's true, but I was fascinated at how much I did not know.
Mm.
And I'm
Well,
fascinated with how much I learned. And so when I wrote the book, I used the word we and our, like we're in this together, because yes, I too have a lot of work to do in my own conversation world.
anything in particular, and I suppose this is in the book, but does just really strike you or that, really raised your eyebrows in your research?
There were a lot of those in a
I'm
lot of
sure.
areas, but I think by far the biggest one was that listening is the number one conversation skill. Most of us aren't very good at that, and there's a reason why, which I can get to in a minute if you're interested.
Would
Um,
definitely.
and like honestly, a first grader is a better listener than someone who has a PhD, typically.
Interesting.
Um, and we all have to work on this. And at any given moment, there's a good chance the person who's listening to you isn't listening to you. And isn't that the feelings that come with that when we're not heard? The long list of negative, horrible feelings that come up is very disturbing. And then the fantastic feelings of being truly heard are so compelling and so literally delicious to us that that's what we're seeking as humans, is not only to just talk, but also to be heard.
Why aren't people listening? What is the number one, or let's just say the big thing about listening? Why people
I
don't
think
listen?
because physiologically it's difficult, it's more difficult than talking.
I
When
see.
I'm talking, and this isn't true for everybody, but for many of us, when we talk, we're venting, we're relieving ourselves, we're expressing, we're getting things off our minds, and it feels
Mm,
really good.
yeah.
Plus, if the other person's listening, it feels really good. So it just feels good. Listening, you not only have what's going on in your own head, but you're processing what the person is saying, their body language, their micro
Mm.
expressions, the tone of voice. You're looking for the meaning behind the words, perhaps. It's a lot of work. And then you're thinking about, how am I going to respond to this? So there's three big things happening with the listening. It's
It's
just
fa-
harder.
no, it is harder, and it's fascinating that you're saying this. I know that just in my role as a podcast host, and I do some mediation. Of course, I'm a coach, and by the way, as a speaker, you have to be able to listen in a different way. But let me just bring it back to the podcast
Yeah.
host thing. I can do podcasting in a couple of different ways. The way that does not work is when I'm listening to you, but I'm trying to think what will be my next question,
Mm-hmm.
or even listening for the next question that might come out of what you're saying,
Yeah.
rather than really homing in and blocking all of that out and just listening, just hearing you. And again, sort of counterintuitive, the questions come out by themselves. That I
They
don't have,
do.
but they don't if you're not listening, if you're thinking about other things.
Right. And so one of the things I tell people who are really introverted or even shy or
Mm-hmm.
feeling, social anxiety is, if you listen, because their big question is, well, I don't know what to say. Well, you don't have to say anything. Just questions, as you know from being a podcaster and interviewer, a good conversationalist that you are, that questions are the secret. Ask a good question, listen to the answer. You're going to hear clues on what you could comment on or ask next. And, honestly, we are in charge of our conversations. If people say, oh, I don't like social settings because I just feel like people take advantage of me and they talk my ear off, or things get negative, or they start getting us stuck in the small talk loop. Well, we all have control. We can shift things in a second by asking a question. I can even say to you, Kevin, we've talked all about this. How about, I ask you a question, and then we could get all kinds of interesting things going. This is your podcast, though. You're in charge. I'm just answering
Well, no, but to your
questions.
point, we have, you and I have come together with the idea of, this is less of an interview and more of a conversation.
Yes.
And so it would be entirely appropriate for you to ask a question,
Hmm.
if you will, you see, and and therein lies a very very important concept. But let me shift for just a second. What Patty is, hmm, what's a good conversation, or what's a better conversation?
That's a fantastic question. I'm so glad you asked, because for what I think is a good conversation might be completely different
Mm,
from what someone else thinks. So in my book, I let people think about that for a minute and reflect on that and define, well, what is a good conversation for you? Some people like really lively parties where they're getting into political debates and intellectual discussions. And some
hmm.
people think, I just want to hear about what's going on in your life. I want to feel like we have a connection, like we really are getting to know each other. And then there are some really good best practices. Listening is a great concept to be mindful of in a conversation. Respect, authenticity, which we've talked about a little bit,
Hmm.
graciousness, being present, being thoroughly present, not, glancing over to see what's going on my
Hmm.
phone, humility, being vulnerable, sharing, but not too much. It's a real
Wow.
interesting art. And that made it hard to write about because conversation is never linear. It's like we're not, I've been on podcasts where the host asked a question, I answered it. They asked another question, I answered it. They asked another
Yeah,
question, I answered it, which felt a little more like a deposition, I think.
I get that.
But in a conversation, you know how things go all around. I mean, I have to use my hands on this because we can
Hmm.
go off over here and then come back. And you might say, Patty, you said something earlier. And I might say, Kevin, to get back to that other question you asked. It was hard to write about it because it's not a linear process.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, what, you know, what can, what is, let's take people that maybe just find it hard to have a conversation. And in my coaching, for instance, if I'm talking to a leader, and and if, let's just say, one of their desires is to build a better connection with their employees or direct reports or something, there's this concept that I know you're familiar with, management by talking around.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember one client that I had. I mentioned to this about him going out into the workroom floor. It was actually a big um, warehouse type of really a manufacturing thing, and he spent most of his time in his office. And I asked him about, how he gets out and just goes to the different stations and talks to folks. And it was like he looked at me like, "What?" And he said, "Well, what are you talking about?" I mentioned management by walking around, and he literally asked me, what would I talk to them about? I said, "It doesn't
Ah,
matter." I said,
yeah.
I said, "Would you be interested in doing that?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, let's go do it right now." He almost freaked out. I'm not exaggerating. I said, "Come." He was willing. He said,
Mm-hmm.
"Okay." So we walk out into this a very large assembly place, and I said, "Now I'll just say, use his name, call him Joe." It wasn't Joe, but I'll say, "Joe, okay, see that person right over there? They're working by themselves. Go over there and just have a basic chat." And he looked at me and said, "What do I say?" I said, "Just
Yeah.
start off with, 'Hey, man, what's going on?
Yeah.
Tell me what you're doing here. How are
Don't
things
freak them
going?'"
out or anything.
No, just stay. And he went, had maybe a 5 minute conversation, came back. He said, "I can't believe this. Where this guy was in his late 40s." He said,
Yeah.
where have I been all my life?"
I mean, it's so funny you say that because, like I said earlier, my dad was the local Chevy dealer and, he ran the business. He had he had a couple of salespeople, but he also did some sales work too. And he took the business over from his father, who started it during the Great Depression, which is crazy, but I don't know how he, well, I do know how he did it. It was one conversation at a time.
Mm.
But I used to work there during holiday breaks,
Oh, wow.
summers, beginning when I was 16, all the way through when I graduated from college. So 6 years off and on, I
Wow.
worked there. And I was always astonished at how often my dad would say, I'm going out, I'm going to go up to the bakery, or I'm going to go up to the bank, and he'd be gone for 45 minutes, an hour. And I used to think, golly, he doesn't spend much time here. Or he'd be out in the shop talking to the mechanics. And I couldn't quite understand it. And then it dawned on me, oh, this is how he's keeping the relation. He's got some presence in the community. He's keeping up the relationships. Like he would wander up and see the lady that ran the newspaper. Vita Panikvar was her name. He'd go up and chat with her, and he'd find out about, well, what's happening in town. And people knew he was there and knew how friendly he was. And that was what kept the business going. And so, related to that, my good
Fascinating.
friend, Dr. Don Christian, who is the president and CEO of Concordia University here in Austin,
Oh,
it's
my.
our Concordia University, Texas, his line, which I use all the time, is work doesn't always happen at your desk.
Wow.
And there are so many people that think, well, if I'm in the office or I'm working, I have to have my head down on the laptop, working, working, working. And that's actually only going to get you so far.
I had a
Pe-
conversation. Oh, please keep going,
I was
please.
going to add one more thing and say that it's been shown through research that if you are able to have a conversation at work with your coworkers on many types of topics, including non-work topics, you are actually considered a more valuable employee than someone who is on the computer all the time and never
Wow.
takes a break or talks to anybody. So in this
Wow.
day and age of all these layoffs, I don't know if the algorithms are taking this into consideration, which is a little frightening to me, but being
Yeah.
social, not overly social, of course,
Right.
you still have to get your work done,
Right.
but
Right.
being that person that people feel comfortable around and can have a chat with is a big skill. It's a huge skill for work.
I worked with an executive. This was probably 10 years ago, and she was very high up in her organization. And we were having the conversation about management by walking around. And as we got into the conversation, I'll be honest with you. One of the reasons why I don't is because, you know, first of all, I don't want to disturb people. They're working, and if I come into the workplace or their department, everything stops because they think they need to turn their attention to me. And then she said, and to be quite honest with you, Kevin, I really don't think they could care less about,
Mm.
that they care about speaking to me. She didn't mean this in any other way than people don't care if I come in there, and I mean they're not like waiting with bated breath that I walk through there. And I just said,
Mhm.
all with all due respect, you are so wrong about that. You're
Mhm.
so high up that people would just love to see you and say hi to
People
you.
love and need to be acknowledged, for
Yes,
starters. Like,
yes,
you're a person. You're not just an
yes.
employee. You're not just
Correct.
a workhorse here. You're actually a person.
Yeah.
The last real job I had where I was actually working for somebody, I worked at an advertising and PR agency here in town. And our boss, it was a woman, she really believed that not only should we work as a team on work projects, but she really encouraged us to throw birthday parties for each other. And, if we got a new client, she'd be the first one to run out and get a bottle of cold, bubbly champagne. And it's like, I don't care if it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we're pouring a bottle of champagne and we're going to toast to this new client. And then, of course, you can get back to work.
Yeah.
We'll make another pot of coffee and you get back to work. But she truly believed, both inside the organization and out with clients, that we needed to spend time
Yes.
over lunch talking, understanding each other, bonding, because that made us work harder for each other. It made us, really want to do good work.
Wow.
We
Y-
cared.
Yes,
There it
it's
is. We
amazing. There it
cared.
is. There it is.
We cared. Yeah. And I I, sometimes when I go to my gym and I see the manager of the gym wandering around and she's checking to see if there's dust on the windowsills and if everything's working and everything looks good, but she doesn't talk to us. I wish she
Mm-mm.
would talk to
Right.
us.
Would probably learn a lot as well, wouldn't she, about what
Hmm.
people think about, the gym and or to your point, just making the connection,
And
with people.
I think maybe they don't. Sometimes people don't because they're afraid people are going to just complain all the time.
Right.
And if
Good
that's
point.
happening, then it means that there are complaints that aren't being addressed.
That's correct.
So
That's exactly right.
what
No,
an
you're
interesting conundrum that is,
yeah.
isn't it?
It really is. And you know, the thing about it is in some of my work, in consulting, where we would do like a climate assessment inside of an organization, I mean, they call them employee engagement, these sorts of things. And I always tell the leaders, I say, listen, when we do this and you open up and let's just say you communicate to your people, hey, I want to hear from you. Uh, you're going to hear from them, but it's almost like a surge. But then if you continue, maybe to your point, go out and just talk, it becomes less and less than that. You see,
Right.
because you start to hear the complaints, assumingly you are resolving some of the issues. But then, again, as you go out there more often, there's going to be a tendency less for them. But there's sort of, so if she went out there and started talking to people in the gym, yeah, maybe her first couple of times she'd hear a lot of complaints.
Hmm.
Tell me, what can we do better?
Yeah. It would be nice if I could
Ah,
hear that.
simple.
What could we do better? Because
Yeah.
I have a few ideas and they're not
Yeah.
just complaining, they're
Right.
ideas. So
Right.
related to that, there's a whole section in my book on drainers and downers.
Ooh.
Because I think that's one of the reasons why some people don't socialize is they're just really afraid I'm going to get stuck with
Right.
the person who talks too much, who complains, who never gets into any fun, interesting,
Mm.
stimulating topics. And I think that's this hesitancy. So
Mm.
I address the
Oh,
whole
love that.
topic of drainers and downers on a spectrum ranging from, if you know there's the person in your neighborhood that if you do more than a wave and a greeting, you're going to get an earful of something you don't even want to hear about. You can minimize contact with that person, avoid them, hold up your boundaries. And then we have all the different range from listening for a few minutes and then exiting the conversation graciously, maybe listening a little longer, a little deeper. And then I have one strategy that let's say you're at work and you're a manager and you have a constant complainer, like this person just cannot stop complaining. This isn't for everybody. I don't know if I could do this, but you can take them to lunch, set aside 2 hours, bring a big thick notepad and a juicy pen that's not going to run out, and just have them express every single complaint, manage the conversation. Oh,
I
it's
did
kind of
not
humorous.
see this coming.
It's
That's
humorous, isn't it?
good.
But
Yeah.
actually, someone you and I both know actually did this and it
Wow.
worked. Listen, get everything on paper. If they are repeating themselves or going in circles, you have to say, look, Mary, we've already talked about that. You've mentioned that one already. That's number 7. We got that one. Let's move on.
That's
And
good.
just drain them, exhaust them, get everything on
How
the paper.
interesting.
Tell them this is a one-time thing. We will address the problems we can address. You're going to have to handle the ones that are your part, and you're done. And
That's
again,
incredible.
this is not for the faint of heart, but I do know people who have successfully gotten the toxic ick out of their organization by letting the complainer just get it all out on paper. And
Unload.
sometimes the complaints are legitimate. Sometimes they're just a personal beef that they have. Sometimes you discover that this person, no matter what happens, um, they're just negative, and you can make decisions on, is this a person that we need to put elsewhere in the organization, or, help
That's
them find
fascinating.
another.
It really is
Yeah.
because it really is. I think it's a very doable approach, but you're right. It might not be for the faint of heart. But the alternative is to just allow that person to continue to be toxic, if we want to use that word. And what do we then think we ought to do? We'll probably just completely avoid them. Well, that just genders up more complaints, more negativity. And and I always suggest to people that if you have to deal with them, then deal with them in not in, I didn't think of this strategy. I think it's brilliant. I never saw this coming when you said about just exhaust them. But you can do that, or you can try to avoid them and just deal with the tension, the
Yeah.
constant tension of being around
The
them.
constant tension. And again, there are people that we really don't need to spend
Right.
time with. I mean, I've
100%.
gotten way more selective over the years
Good for
of
you.
who are the people that I spend more time with versus the ones that I may check in with once a quarter or not at all. Or, just as a friend of mine who has a way with words, she said, you can just energetically back away from certain people that
Yeah.
aren't mandatory in your life.
Yes.
Family members, that's something people can deal with those as they wish.
Yes.
But yeah, the whole story about this person who just said, I'm going to document everything this person says, because for starters, I think she might have some valid points. And secondly, let's just let her feel heard, because the toxicity is, a person who is disgruntled is going to just create havoc wherever they go. And to let this
Right.
person feel heard, get it all out, and say, you know
S-
what, this is a
Yeah.
one-time thing. We're going to do this one time.
Yeah, see what happens. I mean,
Yeah.
it might be painful for a couple of hours, but the
Mhm.
benefits could be. So, Patty, let's get into just a couple of really more specific things. I mean, you've already laid out some nice tips, but I want to ask a couple of questions about. I'll start with this one. What characteristics or what attributes, you know, make up a good conversationalist? I'm going to start with that, and then the second question is going to be what inhibits somebody from being a good conversationalist. So start with the
Oh
positive
boy, what makes
characteristics.
well, I have a few sections in my book where I talk about the four P's. The four
Mm,
P's.
mm,
Um, Having a positive attitude about it. And there's actually a concept called assuming positive rapport.
mm.
Let's say you're going to go talk to someone you don't know very well or you don't know at all. It could be at work, it could be at the grocery store, it could be on a plane, and or at a networking function or a conference, and you're wanting to break into a conversation, but we get worried like,
Yeah,
what if I say the wrong thing, what if they don't
yeah.
like me? And that kind of negative thinking actually is not helpful and will actually hijack the energy of the conversation before it even starts, because people can pick up on that energy. So to go into something feeling positive, we
Mm.
can do this, people will like us. How often do you walk into
I
a
like that.
conversation with someone and immediately think, I don't like this person?
Yeah.
Person has to try really hard
Yes.
to be that person.
Yeah.
And then the second one is, you be purposeful. Like, what do you want to be talking about? What do you need to be talking about in your conversations? What topics? What issues? What problems? And go back to that management conversation of, what do I need to know that's going on in my organization where we can make it better? So there's that part. And then in contrast to that, to add a little balance, is to be a possibilitarian, to
Mm.
think, okay, I'm going to that family reunion. I'm going to see my Aunt Martha.
Mm-hmm.
And I know she's going to tell that story again about her gallbladder surgery and you're already in your head already thinking, I don't even want to go just because of this one thing. Well, I bet your Aunt Martha has some really great stories, family stories, stories about growing up. What if you came up with questions to get her off the gallbladder topic and directed the conversation and learned
Wow.
something about her and her life? Who was her favorite
Wow.
teacher? How did she meet Uncle Bob? When did they know they were in love?
Wow.
Do you see how you
That
can
is so good.
assume that you're going to have this awful conversation? It's going to be a terrible time and no one's going to like me. Be a positive, purposeful possibilitarian. And then the final one is, and I have to look at these because my brain is so full.
No, that's all right.
Proactive.
Uh,
Um, and I almost should have started with the proactive piece. We're in charge. We're in
yeah.
charge of introducing ourselves. We're in charge of launching conversations. When you're at a party, it is not the host's job to introduce you around. I mean, it's a nice thing for a
It's a
host to
nice
do,
thing.
and I try to do it when I can. But in a large um, event like a wedding or a bridal shower where there's a lot of people, it's your job to introduce yourself and to get conversations started. So being proactive. So those are four. Um,
Wow.
there's also four C's, but that's my free chapter on my website. So if people go to my website, intentionalnetworker.com or
Intentionalnetwork.com. Mm.
intentionalnetworker.com
Okay.
or pattydinucci.com. And you go to the free resources, that chapter, the four C's. Um,
And
I
I
won't
hope I
blow
hope
the
people will
surprise
go
on
to
that
it.
one.
Yeah, I haven't
Yeah.
thoroughly gotten through your book, but I've read enough to understand. It is a
Yeah.
good book. I say that
So
very sincerely. Yeah.
the book is filled with all kinds of
Yeah.
attributes of
Yeah.
good conversationalists. And
Yeah.
that's not to say that all of us have to be exactly the same,
Sure.
but when you follow these basic philosophies, you become more likable. People want to listen to you. You know, a really interesting thing is a friend of mine that I know through a couple of business circles, she decided she was going to go for an entire week without complaining.
Oh,
And she said, she wrote about this on LinkedIn. And she said, first of all, it was hard because she noticed how much we complain.
yeah.
And secondly, it taught her that you can complain and ask for what you want in a much nicer way than we often do. Um, and that's just been resonating with me for the last couple of weeks since I read that. So,
Can you think of an example of how you might do that?
well, let's say you went to a restaurant and you ordered something and the order arrived, and let's say you asked, I didn't want onions on this, and the onions were on there. Well, instead of like getting all upset
Yeah.
and personally attacking the wait staff,
Yes.
you could say, "Oh my goodness, I think I think I asked for this without onions. Would it be possible for you to
Yeah.
fix this? Could I get this?" You could just be more gracious and nice
Yes.
about it, as opposed to
Yes.
saying, "This isn't what I ordered."
Yes.
People have this sense of outrage.
Yeah.
They feel entitled to outrage.
Yeah. It's happening more and more as
It
well,
is.
you know. Now,
Mm-hmm.
so part of what I heard though you say just a moment ago about approaching people. By the way, I it would not be unusual for, me to approach the host. If let's say that you were in the room, I knew who you were, but I'd never met you. I thought it might be an important connection, but I knew the host. I might go to the host and say, "Listen, would you mind introducing me to Patty?" You
Mm-hmm.
see,
Yeah.
or I could come do it myself. But the point is that that introduction also helps. So,
Yes.
but the other thing that I heard you say, really, that I really took from what you're saying, is that a good conversationalist is a curious person, aren't they?
Yes.
If you approach somebody
Yes.
with curiosity, the it just flows. You're just curious.
You are
Who are you?
curious. Yeah. I mean, being curious about life. There's that whole uh, Dale Carnegie line about it's better to be interested than interesting.
Oh, love
You remember
that,
that?
man. It's
So,
been a long time.
so I played with that a little bit, and I think it's good to be interested and interesting. And
Yeah,
here's what I mean by that. I think people who are naturally curious about life, about people, about the world,
yeah,
um, they read books, they go do things, they're not afraid to expand their social circle and, hang out with some new people. Um, and when we bring that to conversations, I think we're more relatable. We have more topics we can talk about. Like, honestly, I know people where they honestly cannot get off the topic of their grandkids. And I cannot wait. My son just got married. I know having grandkids is going to be absolutely fantastic. I know that. But when that's the only thing you can talk about, um, I feel like can
no, I
we
get
go
it.
beyond that?
Yeah, yeah.
And studies actually show that being curious and interested in all kinds of things, including all kinds of people, makes you it leads to a healthier, happier, longer, more vibrant life
Oh my
because you're
goodness.
expanding the circle.
Yeah,
I mean, the Harvard study that's been going on for something like 85 years, it's been all over the news. Um, they've been studying people throughout their entire
mm,
lives and really seeing what happens to the people whose worlds are very small and what happens to people who are open to new conversations, new social circles, new
new
hobbies,
ideas. Yeah,
new books, new TV
yeah.
shows.
I always tell people, I think that's brilliant what you're saying here, and I want to bring up a couple, what I think can be beneficial to many, many people, and that is about people who have been married a long time and go to the restaurant and can't speak two words to each other. But before you do that, let me
Mm.
just zero in on what you just said. I've often thought the idea that the older we get, the the narrower our universe gets. Very naturally, by the way, without trying. I'll
Hmm.
give you the analogy is this. I love tennis. I particularly love singles tennis. I've always been competitive, pretty decent player, and loved it, in that sense. I know that as I get older, uh, thankfully I haven't reached that mark yet, that I'm going to have to narrow down and probably play doubles more just
That's why
because
they invented
physically.
pickleball.
Correct, and that I agree with that. No, that's you're exactly right. That's
Yeah.
actually opened up so much. But the
Hmm.
idea is that when our universe expand or so contracts, I guess you could say a little bit. Let's say just because of physical health, and the
Hmm.
older you get, people around you pass away. You can't get out, so you don't have as much conversation. You may not be as tied into the technology, and all of these things start to shrink your life. I say, okay, counterbalance that,
Hmm.
expand, and that's what you're saying. Start to
Hmm.
expand a little bit more. So
Yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
maybe. Go ahead. No,
And
please.
when there's actually, things that we can, when we're young, we want to try everything. At least
Yeah.
I did. And then your world does start to get
It,
smaller because you get more selective. You are clear on what works for you, what's fun, what's
true.
enjoyable. There's
Yes.
certain things just like, yeah, well, several years ago, I was a distance cyclist. I did
Oh
the
wow.
MS 150 from Houston to Austin, which is 150 miles. I did that 5 times. I haven't been on my bike in probably 5 years because I am really afraid if I flip over the handlebars and
Exactly.
break my wrist or, break my jaw or
Right.
whatever. I mean, suddenly I can't work.
Right.
So, and that's happening more and more in Austin where our
Yeah.
traffic is just getting crazy. But
Yeah.
anyway, yes, our worlds do get smaller because certain limitations. But
Correct.
I love you said it perfectly. Counter that by hmm, let's join a book club or let's take up a new hobby like French cooking or you know let's let's start a let's start a study group. My mom joined a
Oh, love
study
that,
group.
man.
She was invited. Actually, didn't join it. She was invited. Probably somebody died and she could take the place. But they did this thing where every month somebody was in charge. They had to read a book or have an experience of some sort that they were going to report on or do a
Hmm.
slideshow. And I think my mother was in her 60s. She's probably around my age. And I noticed how she just blossomed under that. I mean, she was always
Goodness.
really an interesting person, but to leave like a certain group that she'd been in and go to this group stimulated her. That's the word I'm looking for, stimulated her.
Yes.
So when our worlds get really small, um, we lose our ability to converse on topics.
You know, I just thought about this as you were talking about this. My late and I will say great mother-in-law, she passed away a couple of years ago.
Mm.
Boy, what a loss. She was just an amazing conversationalist. She truly was. As a matter of fact, when she left up in Moline, Illinois, which is, and you
I
probably
know
know where
where that
that is,
is.
yeah, the Quad Cities there. And when we would go up there for, say, Christmas or something, we'd spend maybe, several days with them or whatever. It was literally in the morning time because they had a downstairs sort of an apartment. We stayed there. And between myself and Jane, who is the daughter, and our two daughters, it would be this race to get up in the morning and get up there and have some Nancy time. You know,
Just with Nancy,
just with Nancy.
one
And so
on one.
I would head up and I would see Jane's already up. I say, and I maybe if I heard she was in the bathroom, I'd head upstairs because, you're just trying to get some time with her because it was such an amazing experience and guess what she did? She asked questions
Yes.
and she
She was
always asked
interested.
about you. I got to tell you this though. This is so amazing. I'll never forget this the rest of my life. When after Jane and I were married in 1986, it was one I think it was the next Christmas after that. I we went to Jane's home and we were staying there. This is before kids, and I remember, yeah, I don't know if I'd gotten there in the morning or whatever, or I got there and Jane left and started having this conversation with Nancy, and she somehow knew that I loved tennis, and she started asking me about Roger Federer and why I thought he was so great. And then she put through a couple other names out there and threw some concepts about tennis out there. And I said, Nancy, I had no idea that you knew that much about. Oh, she goes, oh, I don't really know anything, I just find it interesting, whatever she said. So we just continued talking, had a conversation. Later that day, I said, Jane, I had no idea that your mom was had any interest in tennis. She said, Kevin, she said, I wouldn't normally tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this. I guarantee my mother researched it before you come in here so
Yes.
she could have a conversation with
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's so, if you would to just sit down with a notebook and journal and document all the things that she did. I
you.
mean, this is what I've been doing for the last 8 years is
Mm,
deconstructing what do great conversationalists do? And
mm,
I can just see the tip of the iceberg there, but I can see where that's,
mm-hmm.
she wanted so badly to have time with you and to
Yes.
have a meaningful conversation with you. It wasn't about her. In fact, she went
Correct.
through the effort to learn. Wow.
And by
I
the way,
mean,
she was in her, she would have been in her 70s, I think, at that point, maybe.
wow.
Yeah.
And I think that's what often happens. There's one section of my book where I
Mm-hmm.
actually describe, based on research, what do
Mm,
people who have vibrant long lives, in other words, they're vibrant in their older age longer,
mm.
they are still active, they're still mentally
Yeah.
nimble, and
Yes.
granted, there's all kinds of things that can get in the way of that, and it's
Yes.
out of our control to some degree, but
Yes.
the part that is within our control is
Yes.
introducing themselves at parties, learning people's names, not telling the same story over and over again, asking about other people, being interested, being
Yes.
open to new topics,
Oh, that's brilliant.
as opposed to the person that just becomes more and more
Yeah.
reclusive and ornery and
Yes. And might I
close-minded
say, she
and
was actually quite a shy person. So
hmm,
she worked at it. This
she
was not
worked at
something
it.
that just, I think, naturally came out. So I have a couple more questions for you here. One of them is back to this idea, and I'm looking for a tip. And then the second question I want to ask you really is about anything that's in your book or some ideas or thoughts that you really want to bring up in this conversation that would be helpful to our audience. So back to, I see this all the time. I'm sure you do as well. I can I can say with great uh, pride. I try not to use the word pride, but with just loving feelings that my wife and I have been married 36 years. We can still go to a restaurant, still go have a cocktail, and have a robust conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I
I love it.
want people to know that. And by the way, it's because we worked on it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's important to just, it's just not. But what about those who I see all the time? You can sense that they've been married a long time. They sit across from each other, and it's worse now, of course, with the phones. But even before the phones, they're not even in tune. They have no conversation, and I see this fairly often.
Mm-hmm.
What do they do? What's happening there, and what do they do about it?
Well, I see entire families that are like that. They're out at a nice
Oh,
restaurant and they're all together and they're sitting around and they're all looking at their phones and not talking. And I see
yeah.
this with people who are with their young children. Their young
Mm,
children are on their little phones
mm,
or screens, and the mom or the dad or both the mom and dad are.
mm-hmm.
It's just it's troubles me. It makes me very
Yeah.
sad. But back to what is it? Well, you said we work on it. And why do you work on it? Because you care.
Mm,
I think you can't stop caring.
mm-hmm.
Caring,
Mm.
actually, I'll do a spoiler. Caring and curiosity are two of the four C's.
Oh
If you
my.
don't care, um, and if you don't have some curiosity about the world and about life and about your partner or your conversation partner, your life partner, whatever, it's not going to go anywhere if you're stuck in your
Mm,
own head. Now, we've all been in these places where we've had a long day. I've had plenty of instances where I've
mm-hmm.
spoken at a conference, I'm traveling, I'm packing, I'm, la la la, and I get on the plane to come home
Sure.
And I am really not in a place where I want to talk to
Right.
my seatmate,
Hmm.
or I'm really going to kind of feel it out a little bit and see, is this somebody that is going to be exhausting to me?
Yes.
Or are they going to be somebody who's rather pleasant? Or what's my strategy for
Yes.
managing that? Like maybe we can have a short conversation. Like maybe right as we're approaching landing, we'll have a conversation
Right.
where I know it's going to be only 5 or 10 minutes.
I
There's all
love it.
these tricks we use.
Hmm.
There's all kinds of tricks. But
Sure.
man, you have to care. And I
Hmm.
think we live in a world where technology has definitely
Hmm.
put a dent in our
Yes, it
ability
has.
to have conversations. I know it's put a dent in my ability to concentrate. I find myself not reading as many books as I used to,
Hmm.
which I'd
Yeah.
like to change. Um,
Yeah.
there's a lot that's a whole
Ditto to
conversation in
that.
itself.
So, Patty, is there any other, item or area or thought or idea or tip that you would like to put out there that we haven't? I'm sure there's many of them, but
Hmm.
maybe one that just sort of jumps out at you that might be particularly helpful to people who want to learn how to have better conversations or anything along that lines.
I think, well, here's a big one. People often say they're introverted
Mm.
or they're shy or they're introverted and shy. And the first thing I learned about that was being introverted, extroverted, ambiverted has to do with how your battery is charged. Like, what does
Oh,
socializing do to your battery? Does it recharge it or
oh,
does it drain it? And
very
once
interesting.
you're introvert, ambivert, extrovert, you're pretty much that person your whole life, pretty much that whole
Mm.
person. Shyness is different. Shyness is you just haven't had as much practice, skill. You didn't have the role models. Maybe you had trauma. Maybe you
I
lived in a
see.
place where there weren't very many people when you were growing up, and you didn't
Mm-hmm.
build the social intelligence, which is your ability to make friends, make
Mm-hmm.
conversation,
Mm.
engage,
Mm.
say the right thing. And by saying the right things, it's mean not the being able to just converse. Okay,
Yeah.
that's the main thing. And that shyness can be overcome with practice.
Mm.
Socializing, conversation is something that it's like I use the analogy of doing push-ups. If I want to get really good at push-ups, I'm going to have to do more push-ups. It
Wow.
doesn't I'm
Bottom
that's
line. Yeah.
just how it goes. If you
Yeah.
want to be a runner, you got to run. If you want to be
Yeah.
a writer, you got to write. So
Yeah.
again, it's that wanting to, and that's why I put in my subtitle, it's the essential guide for anyone who wants to have better
Oh,
conversation.
I love that.
If
I
you
didn't
don't
think
want
about it.
to, I don't think you're going to
Okay.
open this book
Right.
unless
Right.
somebody makes you do it, unless your
Right.
boss says you have to read it.
Right.
So
Because to your point, as we get older, if you want to say it this way, it's a bit of a crass way to say it, but you will shrivel up
you will
if
shrivel
if,
up.
if you are not doing things to continue
Mm-hmm.
on. And as you said, I've read this research and I've seen documentaries
Mm-hmm.
about this idea that the things that sustain older people is the relationships, the conversations, these
Mm-hmm.
sorts of things, what keep you blossoming, to whatever
Yeah.
degree you can. I think that's just brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Well,
that's a really big one. And to go back to the introvert extrovert
please.
thing, I think too often people um lean on the introversion and even shyness thing as a little bit of a crutch. And that's a
Agree.
little crass way to say it too, but
Agree.
it's just an excuse. It's an excuse. And it means, yes, you have to work at this a little
Yes.
harder. There's a lot of things I have to work at harder than a
Yeah.
lot of people. Um,
Yeah.
we
People
all have
say
those
that to
things.
me. Yeah, I'm an introvert. And I'm kind of like, so what? I mean, I could just give you a lot of examples of people who were shy or introverted, but they worked at it a little bit
Hmm.
and suddenly just learned a few skills, but to
To
your
make it
point,
easier.
to make it easier, and so maybe you are an introvert. Okay, so what? Maybe you are
Yeah.
shy. Okay, so what? Try and try again. I will say this also, and for parents that are out there, especially if you have younger kids or whatever, we intentionally, I mean, part of it was in our nature because Jane and I both grew up, as entertainers and we were in theater and all these sorts of things. But we deliberately talked about this, and that is getting both of our daughters into theater, into
Yeah.
community theater,
Hmm.
and I think the proof is in the pudding. If any of you all ran into my daughters, and some
Hmm.
people watching this know this, they'd have a very easy conversation with you
Yeah, and
because
that was
they're, yeah,
intentional. It
intentional,
was
correct.
intentional. And I think that's why my dad had us, well,
Hmm.
that's one reason why he had us come work for him is
Yeah.
I learned I mean, even now it's been years. I mean, years, decades since I worked for my dad. And I still think of things like, oh my God, that's why he did that. I'm
Mm,
glad I learned that from him.
wow.
But I want to add one more thing.
Please
One
do.
more thing, since we're talking about introverts and shyness and all that. Extroverts, people think that I'm very comfortable in social situations. My battery gets charged. I have the gift of gab.
Mm,
Some people say, "Oh, I don't need to read your book. I have the gift of gab." It's like, think again, because
mm,
a good conversation is mutually rewarding. It's mutually enjoyable. And
mm.
sometimes when people have that gift of gab, it means they overtake
Very good.
conversations and
Very
they're
good
not
point.
listening. Yeah, I
Honestly,
know.
I yes.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Please
I
finish.
know plenty of people where
Yeah.
if I schedule a call with them, it's going to be at least an hour, and
Hmm.
I may get to speak 5 minutes. I mean, I have to really be intentional and say, you know what, I'm calling them to just hear about them. They're not
Mm.
going to ask. We may spend 5 minutes on me, and that's fine. But as a result, I'll be the most fascinating person on the call because I'm doing all the listening. So I have to look at it that way. But the
Th-
gift of gab is not necessarily your free pass, you
that's
know.
right. Nor necessarily an attribute to your point. You know,
Hmm.
and I'll be honest with you, if I had to fall one way or the other, I am that person that tends to talk too much, and I have to be careful. I mean, I have to be
I
thoughtful about it. You
I
see?
think I mean, since you and I met, I don't know,
Yeah.
8, 7, 8 years ago at a
Yeah.
conference,
Mm.
just remember I do remember we were just in a hallway
I
waiting, standing in
remember
line
that.
to go inside something, and we
Hmm.
started talking, and
Hmm.
I just thought, wow, this guy is so easy to talk to.
Mm.
I mean, if you pull up a topic and you're interested, that's when, and I think that makes you a good podcast host too.
Well, you beat me to the punch because I was just about to mention the same thing. And to my listeners, is that, Patty DiNucci here is not just somebody who wrote a book, did some research. You practice what you preach. I
Mm.
remember the same thing in the conversations we've had at conventions where you, I remember, I can still remember thinking this lady is such a good conversationalist. But
Thank
that
you.
was after just being enthralled in the conversation.
Yeah.
And you walk away just feeling good, that
Yeah. And I
you
don't remember what we talked about, but
I
I
don't
know it
either.
wasn't small talk. It was
No.
something we might have been commenting on a speaker we'd heard
Yeah.
or something, and we just got right down in there. And not everybody has that ability or the courage to get down into the meat of a conversation and express how you feel
Yes.
about something
Yes. Yes.
in an
I want
engaging way, not in an offensive way, in
That's
an
exactly
engaging
right.
way.
Real quick, I mean, we're going to stretch this out to 2 hours. We are going to do the Joe Rogan thing. We keep going here because we talked about that
Okay.
last time. We'll go 3, 4 hours. No,
Well,
but
I do have another podcast
uh,
at noon, high
oh,
noon.
you
So
do?
we
Okay.
can go for 20 more minutes
No.
and then I've got to run to the bathroom.
Well,
That's too
no.
much information right there.
I won't go there. But two things. One, a, a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours who now lives in Austin, Jim Cathcart. I'll never forget when I met him. I don't remember what convention it was. So it was probably, 7, 8 years. I don't know. I remember I met him, and of course I knew who he was because
Hmm.
he's pretty legendary,
He's been
really.
around a while.
He's been around a while. He's in fact, he coined the idea of relationship selling. You see,
Yes,
so
yes.
I remember I was just heading up to my room for whatever, maybe it was the end of the evening or something. He was standing by the elevator. I knew who he was. He didn't obviously know who I was. I was just going to say hi or something like this. He and I ended up standing in front of this elevator. We never got on the elevator, laughing, almost on the floor laughing for, I bet you, 15 minutes.
Hmm.
Just, and, and I just, well, part of me was like, wow, this is Jim Cathcart, almost on the floor laughing, not at what I said, just the conversation we were having,
Yeah.
and just got into this deep conversation. And and really kudos to him because again, at the National Speakers Association convention, when you run into a Cathcart or some other, or even a Danucci, you're kind of like you're hoping you can have just a 2-minute conversation with him. But
Right,
he's very
right.
gracious with his time and
Yeah.
ability to speak with anybody. So there's that. I had to throw that out there. And the second thought was, well, I don't remember what the second thought was. Oh, I know what it was. Here it is. And I want to ask you about this, but I had to throw that out there with Cathcart. The one thing that I think is really prevalent today and gets in the way of conversations, and I see this maybe all too often, where people are so easy about bringing their politics
Mm-hmm.
into a conversation, even with people they don't know. Or, when I talk with people, if we get into a conversation, and let's say politics do come up, or because politics is expanded now. Now it's not just politics, it's about, social justice and social everything else.
About
All these
everything.
things
Yeah.
eventually get into politics. I'm I'm intentionally very careful, I guess to say, not to really show my politics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not because I'm afraid to show my politics, but because I know where it can take a conversation
Mm-hmm.
and how ugly it can get. And
I think,
especially if
yeah.
I don't know who's on the other side,
Mm-hmm.
if we come around to the idea that we have the basic same philosophy, okay, we may go a little bit deeper than that. But even then, I know the conversation is going to go negative. I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Oh, that's such a big one. But I think, we live in an era where there's so much information and
Hmm.
everybody has a billboard, everybody has a bullhorn, everybody's their
Wow.
own,
That's good. That's
TV
good.
show host. And I will tell you honestly, growing up, I don't know what my parents' politics were
Oh.
beyond my dad
Mm-hmm.
believed in the golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
We were Episcopalians. We went to church every Sunday. My parents were
Mm-hmm.
just good people. They were kind
Mm-hmm.
people. They didn't gossip. They didn't speak badly of anybody, at least
Wow.
not around us kids. They didn't do that. And
I
I,
love
I
that.
know part of it was that they were just that's private.
Yeah.
I don't even think they told each other who they
I think it
voted
used to
for.
be that way, didn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Mhm.
private. And the other thing is, why would my dad tick off half or more of his customers? Why would he do
Yeah.
that?
Yes.
So they were very, they were, and there's
Yes.
so many other things to talk about,
Yes.
it was interesting. I was at the post office the other day dropping off some books that were going to go to some of my people on my comp list. And the post office clerk initially was super friendly, upbeat, very helpful, very knowledgeable, efficient, all that. And somehow we got into this. I don't know how she ended up going there, but she talked about how she was just terrified of letting her daughter grow up in this world and how we just live in a terrible
Oh,
world and la la
wow.
la la.
Yeah.
And I said to her, I said, raising kids is terrifying. I have my son's 31. I'm glad part. He turned into a great human being. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, God. But I said, what other era would you want your daughter to live in?
Mm-hmm.
Like, can you pick an era that would have
Mm.
been
That's
better?
interesting. Yeah, that's a
And
good point.
and I didn't mean to be a contrarian, but I wanted to kind of give her a little,
Yeah.
yes, there's always been bad things in the world, but and, and she had me 100% until she just went down that path. And I don't know why
There
she
you
did.
go.
I don't
There you
why.
go.
I think we feel compelled to share our
Mm-hmm.
feelings, our philosophies, our politics,
Our
um,
frustration,
our
you see?
frustration.
Yeah.
I think yeah, there are plenty of things that we need to work on in the world.
Yeah.
Leadership, we could talk
Yeah.
about leadership ad
Yeah.
nauseum, but there's a term for that too. It's called narrative shopping, where let's
Oh,
say you're in a
interesting.
conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a social event. You're having a couple beverages, cup of
Mm-hmm.
coffee or a glass of wine or whatever, and the conversation is going well, and all of a sudden somebody brings up a topic or makes a comment that sours the whole thing because we
Yes.
have to go there now.
Very
That's called
interesting.
narrative shopping,
I'll be
where
darned.
this person felt like even though it wasn't appropriate, nobody else had brought it up. It wasn't even, they had to slide it in there somehow. And it's
Yeah.
prevalent and it ruins conversations.
That is 100%, and I do have a great amount of appreciation. Again, I have my politics, and I there are
Mhm.
a select few people that I will speak to them about, but it's just that I care more about other people's relationships
Me too.
that I just rather not go there with them.
Hmm.
It's just it all we end up doing is venting, and we don't actually
Hmm.
accomplish anything or
Hmm.
become more educated, and so
Yeah, and
anyways,
it's our negativity bias. I mean,
yeah, that's
a
right.
negativity bias, remembering the negative things that are going on in the world
Hmm.
is what has kept us all here
That's true.
alive for
Yeah.
tens of thousands of years
Hmm.
and beyond is remembering, but now we're getting too much of it and we're overdosing on it.
Yeah,
And it's just like, come
overdosing.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, would you please just share, and all of this, of course, will be in the show notes, if you will, but please share where you would like people to find you, your book. I want to really, really encourage those who are listening to this podcast or watching it by YouTube. Patty DeNucci is the real deal. She's not just another person who wrote a book, and I say that very sincerely. I've known her for many years, and again, I think it's self-evident just by listening to her. So please, Patty, share with the
Well,
audience.
again, you can go to my website, and I think the easier one to
Mm,
remember is intentionalnetworker.com. And there'll be a pop-up, which, I'm as annoyed with pop-ups as most of us are, but this time I thought this has to come up. Fill that out, and you'll have access to several free resources, including a free chapter from my new book, a free chapter
nice.
from my Intentional Networker book, and then we have a couple of other. Oh, I know what's in there. This sounds so boring, but it's the appendix of my new book, which the appendix. It's probably, I don't know, 8-10 pages
Oh
of
my.
conversation starting
Oh
questions
wow.
organized by setting. And it's not to say you could not switch out different things, but
Right.
it's a little bit of
Oh, that's brilliant.
inspiration on an opening line that you can use that's not the same old, same old. And people are just loving that. And honestly, there's all kinds of resources out in the world right now where beef up your conversation repertoire and you will definitely find that conversations become easier and more
Wow.
pleasant. So
Wow.
there's that. You can also email me, pattydenucci@gmail.com. If you have a question
Yeah.
specific about this topic that we didn't get to, I'm happy to answer that for you.
Well, and people should know, that, Patty's a coach, she's a speaker,
Mhm.
she's a consultant,
Workshops
all of those things. And so, where don't we need to learn how to be better conversationalists?
everywhere.
Everywhere. So,
My work is cut out for me for this.
yeah.
Someone said, "Are you going to do another book?" It's like, not anytime soon. We're gonna take the legs
Yeah.
on this one and just run with
A
it.
lot of people don't know because I've written a book and I put mine out in 2012. I can almost have, and I don't want to diminish the real people that have post-traumatic stress syndrome, but I can have PTSD over thinking about writing that book because it was
It
painful
was a
for me.
deep,
I mean,
yeah, it was a deep,
yeah,
complex project. And honestly, it wasn't until I hired the right people to
yeah,
really help me
same here.
and invested, I could have remodeled my kitchen.
Same here. No,
But
I
you know what?
completely get
I'm
that.
happy I did the book.
Yep.
Because, a kitchen, big deal. A book,
Yeah.
yeah,
It'll go on forever. Well,
it
listen,
will.
God bless you, Patty. You're just the best. I thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
taking time to be on Grow Yourself. There's no question in my mind that people have learned from listening to this, and I just appreciate you so much.
Oh, back to you. Back to you.
Okay. So we'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye.